Well, we look together at Luke chapter 20, verses 9 onwards, right through to verse 26. I'd like to look at this passage under the title, Living Under the Authority of God. Living under the authority of God. We're looking at the parable of the tenant farmers and also discussion over whether we should pay tax or not. I think you'll find it is very fruitful stuff. On the 5th of April, we will all be judged. Our earnings over the last year will be counted. And we will have either paid the right amount of tax or we will not have done. And the price will have to be paid. And those in authority will be particularly under scrutiny, as the Prime Minister found this week when his tax affairs appeared in the public domain. I remember an era when politicians used to boast about what they earned. The author, Jeffrey Archer, when he was active in politics and his sales of his books took off, he used to boast that his tax bill could pay the salaries of the entire cabinet. He recalled wandering into a bank and seeing an advert which said, "Is your income over £20,000? He said, "I couldn't really answer. Some days it is, some days it isn't." And he wondered why he didn't have more friends. Well, whether we're in the Jeffrey Archer or Rishi Sunak category or not, the 5th of April is Judgment Day on our tax affairs. But then another judgment awaits us all. And rather later than our passage, after Jesus has risen, standing in the middle of the Areopagus in Athens, the Apostle Paul says in Acts 17, verse 30, he says this, "The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." And so you see the proof of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is intrinsically linked to God the Father and his plan to judge the world. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is proof that he will do it. And as we look at Luke 20, I want to look at two aspects of living under the authority of God. I want to look, first of all, at God's righteous judgment, and secondly, our righteous response. Righteous means, in very simple terms, right in God's eyes. God holds all the cards. He decides what's right and what's wrong, and he decides how he will judge it. So first of all, God's righteous judgment. I need to warn you, though, this is the most challenging parable I think Jesus ever told of all the parables. It covers the largest span in human history, from the Old Testament right through to the final judgment. This parable of the tenants also contains perhaps the most violence we ever see in any parable that Jesus told. But I believe if we face its meaning head on, and we enlarge the context to include the encounter which follows it, I believe you will be greatly spiritually encouraged this morning. This parable, the parable of the wicked tenants, primarily describes the history of the people of Israel and their mistreatment of God's messengers down through the ages. But it doesn't just refer to the past. In Matthew 23, Jesus says these words, Matthew 23, verse 29. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, 'If we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation.'" A couple of important observations there about that comment there from Jesus. Jesus is referring here to the past mistreatment of prophets in the Old Testament, and also current rejection of God, and even future persecution of the early church. And when he says in verse 36, all these things will come upon this generation, he is talking not just about the judgment of God, but scholars believe he is also referring to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70, which was a foretaste of God's judgment. Challengingly also, Jesus mentions hell by name in verse 33. So it is not a deniable thing. We're talking here about eternal punishment as well. And Jesus stakes his reputation by talking about hell as a real place that exists. How could it all go so horribly wrong? How could it all go so horribly wrong that these passages are very rarely preached on in churches, very rarely looked at? We jump to the parable, to the conversation about tax and giving to Caesar, but we leave out sometimes these more challenging passages where Jesus is speaking directly. How could it go so horribly wrong? Well, when God's people depart from God's word, they depart from God. And when they depart from God, they are capable of anything. Verse 9 onwards of our reading from Luke 20. Jesus went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. At the time of Jesus, the upper Jordan Valley and the shores of the Sea of Galilee contained vast estates, and they were owned in the main by foreigners, and they gave the care of these estates to local people. And in the absence of the owner, these local farmers had considerable freedom, and the absentee landlord was completely dependent on the honesty and the cooperation of the tenant farmer. Now, we've looked at how this passage might apply to the people of Israel. But how might this also apply to us? What are the more general learnings we might take from the parable of the tenants? First of all, we learn about human privilege. The owner plants the vineyard and places tenants in it as temporary custodians. And that is true of our lives, isn't it? God has done the hard work of planting. He has given us life. He's placed us within this beautiful world that he has made. And even if we are keen gardeners, we have not planted much of it. But we are only temporary custodians. Secondly, we learn about human responsibility. Verse 9, he went away for a long time. Now, it may feel, following the resurrection of Jesus Christ and his ascension into heaven 2,000 years ago, that God has gone away for a long time. There is indeed a long time between creation and the final judgment. But the fatal mistake that these tenants make is they live as if the owner were never coming back. But he is coming back. Thirdly, we learn about human accountability. These tenants, they have no excuse for forgetting about the owner, because every year at harvest time, he sends a servant. He sends a servant. And under the old covenant, that servant is clearly the faithful prophets who told God the truth, even if it was unpopular. Under the new covenant, you could legitimately argue that God's servants are God's faithful church leaders or teachers who point out without fear or favor the truth of the gospel, the truth of God's word. The servant, you see, is there to remind the tenants not of his own opinions, but that they are accountable to God and God's opinions, which are unchanging, and to ask them to give to God what is described in verse 10 as some of the fruit of the vineyard. Some of the fruit of the vineyard. And we might legitimately consider that our requirement as Christians to tithe our incomes, but also to give of our time, our prayers, our hard work, our love, and our obedience. All these things are recognition or our accountability to God as the owner of everything, and our belief in his future return and the final judgment. And if you agree with this interpretation, you'll probably agree that God's servant in these matters comes in a certain amount of weakness. I have no power to compel anyone to obey God in these matters. All I can ever do is warn people. And down through the ages, sometimes God's messengers have been very badly treated indeed. In his book, In God's Underground, Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, who was perhaps one of the most enormous spiritual encouragements to me as a young man growing up. He was a faithful pastor for Christ in the underground church in Romania in the 1950s and 60s, and at a time when many Christians were being mistreated. And he described his arrival here in Craiova prison in Romania. He was thrown into an overcrowded cell, and he met a Muslim called Nassim, who was also a prisoner. He said this, "Our friendship began while I was trying to eat my first meal at Craiova prison. The vile, greasy smell of the soup preceded its arrival in my cell. Shreds of rotten cabbage and unwashed offal floated in scum. But to eat was a duty, and I emptied my dish. Nazin asked, 'How can you eat that food?' His stomach was revolted. I said, 'It is a Christian secret. I think of St. Paul's words, and I rejoice with those who rejoice. I remember my friends in America who right now are eating grilled chicken, and I thank God with them as my first mouthful of soup goes down. I next rejoice with my friends in England eating roast beef, and I get down another mouthful. And so, with many friends in many countries, I rejoice with those who rejoice, and I stay alive.' It is not easy being a servant of the rightful owner of the vineyard." The fourth thing we learn about from this passage is divine patience. Divine patience. The owner does not retaliate at the first sign of rebellion. He sends his messengers again and again. And note the treatment of each messenger deteriorates each time. Finally, he sends Christ. Verse 13, "Then the owner of the vineyard said, 'What shall I do? I will send my son whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him.' But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. 'This is the heir,' they said. 'Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours.' So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him." The tenants make a fatal error in this parable. They act as if the owner was already dead. And their actions in relation to the heir are premeditated. And it doesn't take a legal expert to work out that murder is premeditated killing. And that's what they're guilty of. Many people in modern society act as if God is dead. But he is not dead. And even the death of Jesus was not the end. And Jesus says in this parable, verse 15, "What will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others." When the people heard this, they said, "God forbid." Jesus looked directly at them and asked, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people. It's a pretty cautionary tale concerning the judgment of God and the accountability primarily and initially of spiritual leaders, but all of us before God. I want to give you a little bit of light relief, though, because this has been a really sobering look at a sobering parable. One of the magazines I get is a magazine called Christianity Today, and it has reports of stuff happening all over the world, in the Christian circles. Some of it a little bit light-hearted. This news update, well, I think it's light-hearted, don't you decide. This news update caught my eye. It's from Nigeria. And it's a little mini news article. It said here, a pastor from Evangelical Church Winning All has been arrested on charges that he faked his own kidnapping twice. Albaka Sukaya of Genta Apata Jos allegedly collected a ransom equivalent to $900 from his congregation in mid-November 2022, but raised suspicion when he staged a second kidnapping 15 days later. When questioned by police, Sukuya also admitted to setting a fellow pastor's car on fire. I've heard of people being on fire for God, but this is taking it, I think, to a new level. I think it was he overdid it with that second kidnapping, don't you? If you're trying to raise funds for the church, I do not recommend this as approach. Well, anyway, Zacchaeus is being held accountable, isn't he, for his actions, both by his congregation and by the authorities. But he perhaps should be more concerned about the judgment of God. Because people who live with a knowledge of the judgment of God should live differently from those who deny it and reject it. So having looked at God's righteous judgment, and I do recognize this is a hard thing to look at, let us now consider our righteous response. Now, the conflict between Jesus and the religious authorities, it kind of continues with the sending of spies. And we see here another set-piece encounter following in verse 20. Keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be sincere. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. So the spies questioned him. Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? He saw through their duplicity and said to them, show me a denarius. Whose image and inscription is on it? Caesar's, they replied. He said to them, then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Our righteous response to God involves what I would describe as Caesar reduced. Caesar reduced. Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus ruled from 42 AD to 37 BC. On his death, he left the imperial treasury with nearly 3 billion sesterces because of his preference for diplomacy over costly military campaigns, resulting in a stronger, more consolidated empire. And this reference here to Caesar is meant to intimidate and panic Jesus into saying the wrong thing. Saying no to paying taxes to Caesar would be treasonous and would be a crime. Saying yes to paying it would, of course, make him deeply unpopular with his hearers who resented Roman taxes. But Jesus has control over this situation, and his control is masterful. And note the physicality of the encounter. Jesus says, show me a denarius. And they produce this denarius. And he asks them another question. Whose eyes and inscription are on it? He's speaking with power and authority, asking to see the evidence, as a king would demand to see the evidence before judgment. And everyone will look down at this coin, this tiny little coin. The most powerful ruler in the ancient world, reduced to a tiny image on a chipped coin, the size barely bigger than a human fingernail. The Caesar on that coin could be thrown in the air, could be tossed in the dirt, could be stamped on, even thrown away, and he would be powerless to prevent that happening. And indeed, Caesar was powerless towards the end of his life. He died at the hands of his family and close associates after living as a recluse. And then Jesus looks up from that coin to the spies sent to trap him. And he says in verse 25, then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. Now comes the final challenge. And to God, what is God's? All across the country on the 5th of April, many people will find it relatively straightforward to give to Caesar's what is Caesar's. But they will struggle to understand why they should give anything to God at all. I might also add that we might personally be facing huge problems and difficulties in life, which might seem huge and overwhelming. And this is where I think this challenging passage may be of huge and lasting encouragement to you. My final point is that we need a new mindset in which Caesar is reduced and Christ is glorified, where the things of this world, which seem all-consuming, are reduced to the size of one small coin. And once we've looked down at it, we then need to look up and see Christ glorified. The stone which the builder rejected, now the cornerstone, Christ risen, Christ ascended, and one day returning in glory. Back to Christian pastor Richard Wurmbrand. He was eventually released, and he spoke to the US Senate's Internal Security Subcommittee in May 1966 about his 14 years of imprisonment and torture in Romania. And this is what he said. For years, I never saw the sun, the moon, flowers, snow, stars. I saw no man except my interrogator who beat me. But I can say that I have seen heaven open. I have seen Jesus Christ. I have seen the angels, and we were very happy there. Living under the authority of God, there is no circumstance that need overwhelm us. Let us ask God what it means for us in our lives to live in our situation, to live under the authority of God, with Caesar reduced and Christ glorified.